All right, welcome to the Monday stream. As I said in my tweets, this particular stream is going to be dedicated to the Master System. I want to try to add a little bit of variety to it. I know that I play a lot of original NES games, a lot of Super Nintendo games, so I wanted to try to spice things up to get some different systems in there, some different types of games, and just explore the wealth and variety that is video gaming. Because let's be honest, I mean, retro gaming is more than just the NES. It's more than just the Super NES. It's more than just the Genesis. It's about also the other systems that just didn't really make the cut, the ones that just didn't take off, at least not here in the US. So I'm going to start off with the Master System, and I've got my library of games sitting here with me. It's not nearly as extensive as the NES, but I do have a variety, and I'm going to start off with a tried and true classic beat 'em up, the one that really helped kickstart the entire beat 'em up genre. I am, of course, talking about Sega. Specifically, I'm talking about, as soon as it comes up, Sega again. I am talking about Double Dragon, the Technos designed beat 'em up, the spiritual successor to their popular Renegade or Niketsu Kunio-kun, I think, game, um, and just a smash hit in the arcades, and a game that was ported to just about every home console and computer system in existence at the time. I mean, you're talking about even the Atari 2600 had a port of this game. I haven't played it. It doesn't look like much, but still, that just goes to show that this game was wildly popular at the time because it was something pretty new. Now, of course, the Master System version of Double Dragon is not nearly as well known as the NES version of Double Dragon, which is considered by most people, self included, to pretty much be a classic. So we're going to get started. Now, there's some things that are different between this game and the NES version. For one thing, the graphical style is a little bit different. The enemies aren't quite as big. The backgrounds, it feels like you're a mite bit short in comparison to everything in the background. Now, in the arcade version, the sprites were a fair bit bigger. Um, and in the NES version, I think my memory might be failing me, but I believe that they scaled the backgrounds down a bit. Now, another thing that you might notice about the Sega Master System version of this game is the fact that you do have I guess you would say, brighter color palette. One of the things about the Master System is that in many ways it was technically superior to the Nintendo Entertainment System. In fact, in most ways, in terms of visuals, I think it pretty much was the superior to the NES. However, it does have one major area where it is far inferior, and that is in sound. Now, if you listen to the sound, and the sound on the Master System is a fair bit quieter than the NES, so I had to turn I have had to turn my mic down to try to get it to where that you can also hear the sound. So if you're having difficulty hearing the sound on the Master System, just let me know in the chat, and I will try to adjust the volume levels, because I want you to be able to hear the sound. And if you're familiar with the NES version of these songs, you can do a fair bit of comparison between them. Now, another thing, talking about the NES version of this game as opposed to the Master System version, one of the big complaints of the NES version was that there was no two-player mode, thus taking the Double and Double Dragons, making it almost a legacy name as opposed to being a fun two-player co-op experience. This was probably due to sprite limitations and just the fact that the hardware would have had difficulty given the programming of the time, to really handle that much information on screen. If they had made it two-player, they probably would have had to cut down on the amount of enemies that could be on screen at any given time, which is something that you will see here. You're not going to have nearly as many enemies as was in the arcade original. I'm not certain, but there may not even be as many enemies on screen at a given time as in the NES ports, though I'm not 100% certain on that. Now, the Master System version is much, much more faithful to the arcade original. In fact, I think they really didn't do any major changes to it other than just, you know, port it graphics-wise, and had to downgrade, make the typical things that you have to do whenever you're downgrading it from arcade hardware to a 1986 home console. So but the NES version took more liberties with it in terms of the stage design, in terms of the controls. One of the things that's very much different about the NES version as opposed to the arcade original, and as compared to this port, is that in the NES version they had basically an experience point system in place that made it to where that you didn't actually start off with all of your attacks, and that was one of the things that really made the game unique, was just the amount of attacks. Because you have in this game, you still have, despite the reduced amount of buttons compared to the arcade, because the arcade had 3 buttons, one for jump, one for punch, and one for kick, whereas the home ports typically only had 2 buttons, or in some cases only 1 button. That would be like the Atari 2600 or some of the computer versions. But I think all of the attacks are here. You've got your punch, you've got your kick. If you punch someone repeatedly, you can do an uppercut. You can do a flying reverse kick. You can do a jump kick. You can do a back elbow smash. You can grab someone in a headlock and throw them. You can jump on someone when they're pinned on the ground and just beat them mercilessly. You can also pick up weapons and use them. Considering that this was really, I mean, they had, granted, the company, Technos, had some practice in terms of game design for beat-em-ups with the game that would be brought over to the US as Renegade. But for such an early title in a burgeoning genre, the amount of techniques that are in the game for you to use are just quite astounding, really. And like in the, of course, the sad truth is that if you're playing one of the home ports, I don't know about the arcade original, I haven't played it in forever, but I know that when it comes to the home ports, you oftentimes you don't use much more than jump kicks and elbow smashes. Because the sad truth is, especially in this port, the enemies like to attack quite aggressively. I say attack quite aggressively as they're just kind of standing around. But the fact is, oftentimes if you try to get into a straight up punch and kick fight with these enemies, you will wind up losing a decent chunk of your health before you even knock one down. So jump kicks are definitely the way to go. Jump kicks using weapons, that's pretty much the strategy to win. The elbow smash seems to have been nerfed a little bit as compared to the NES version, because the NES version, the elbow smash was essentially the game breaker, because it was incredibly powerful. You could hit enemies behind you. and I think it would actually take out a lot of enemies in only 1 or 2 hits. Now, another thing that is different between this version and the NES version is the fact that in the NES version it was considerably difficult. In fact, I still haven't beaten the NES version because in that version you had 3 lives, of which you think you could earn an extra life at a certain point value. But in this version, but you didn't have any continues. And once you ran out of lives, well, that was it. The game was over. However, in the Master System version, you have unlimited continues for the first 3 missions, and then you don't have any continues on the final mission. However, there is a trick you can use to actually replenish your ability to continue on the final mission. And since this game is pretty short, I think I'll go ahead and try to beat it before we move on to another game. And I'll show you the method for actually activating the continues on the last mission when we get there. For anyone who might be wondering, I am playing this on the original hardware. However, I am not playing it with the original controller. The original controller for the Master System is not the best. The controls tend to feel very spongy, especially the D-pad and the button. Well, really, everything on it is spongy. The D-pad, the buttons, they just don't have a very good tactile feel, and they don't feel nearly as responsive. So what I'm using a Genesis controller because the Sega Genesis uses the same 9-pin plug as did many joysticks of the time, and as did the Master System. So much like how that you can plug a Sega Genesis controller into an Atari 2600 or 5200 in order to play the games, you can do the same thing with a Master System. You can just use a Sega Genesis. Personally, for my money, I recommend the Sega Genesis 6-button pad, the fighting pad, which was designed with games like Street Fighter in mind. It's a fair bit smaller. The buttons feel less rubbery. Just has a good feeling. Plus, it's got turbo features. If you need that. If I play a shooting game, I might actually take advantage of that, just for the heck of it. All right. Bobo. Always one of the more interesting characters. One of my favorite characters in Double Dragon, just because of his incredibly large and interesting design. He's also one of the more interesting characters in the Double Dragon live action film, for those who might remember that. That was an interesting film. Interesting film. Not exactly classic cinema, but it is a decent slice of 90s cheese. So, you want a video game movie that doesn't take itself too seriously and is weird and very 90s feeling? Yeah, you could go with worse video game film adaptations than Double Dragon. All right. Of course, the Lindas with their ever-present whips. It's always a pleasure to be